Top 14 Favorite Doctors. 14 and 13. The bottom two doctors are a tie in terms of which doctors I have the least time for. I find it difficult to choose, so the joint wooden spoon has to be given to 8th Doctor Paul McGann, the self-proclaimed George Lazenby of the Time Lords, or as I call him, Paul McGon, and the desperately unimpressive current incumbent of the role, Peter Capaldi. McGann's near-mythic popularity in some fan circles has never failed to astound me, given his sole contribution on television up to 2013 was one half-assed Americanized telemovie in the mid-90s which didn't exactly set the universe on fire. I also didn't find him particularly impressive in general, in that, coming across as a very generic figure. Having heard about half a dozen Big Finish audios, which seem to be the general argument for worshipping him from most of his fans, I'm still unimpressed. He was okay in Night of the Doctor, but frankly one shit telemovie, one 7-minute minisode and a bunch of mediocre audios recorded on Sunday afternoons in his slippers do not a favorite Doctor make. Capaldi meanwhile has been impressive in other roles, most notably Malcolm Tucker in The Thick of It. And I was initially pleased by his casting, particularly to see an older man in the role again, which many of us knew who cynics didn't think would ever happen again. Perhaps the idea is to convince everyone an older Doctor is a bad idea after all, as Capaldi has proven incredibly disappointing. To be fair, he's not helped by Clara Mary Sue Oswald, the single most punchably smug and utterly awful companion in the history of the entire program, or by 2 seasons in which it is difficult to find a single episode that rises over mediocre, with most settling for utter shit on a stick, but his bland, charisma-free performance is difficult to pin the blame for on anyone but him. Without doubt the 2 weakest Doctors ever. 12. John Hurt. John Hurt is another of those also-ran Doctors with a grand total of 1 appearance in the role. To be fair, though, he's actually very good in the part in that appearance in Day of the Doctor and makes a more convincing classic-style Doctor than the 2 supposedly real Doctors he's up against. He's John Hurt, so he's a class act and has real presence on screen, but it's 1 appearance in a story that's average at best and nothing more than a New Who televised fan fiction 8th anniversary story. 11. Richard Hartnell. So many of these polls, even the ones that include total also-rans like Paul McGann and John Hurt, completely leave out Richard Hartnell, despite the fact that he played the Doctor in a feature-length television special that remains one of the most loved Doctor Who stories of all time. It's also in Classic Who, which makes him instantly more legitimate to some of us than anyone from 1996 onwards. The justification for this glaring omission, of course, is that Hartnell was playing someone else's Doctor, effectively a recast of William Hartnell's first Doctor. This is hardly a good reason to leave him out, in my opinion. If anything, it makes him even more impressive. Hartnell was given a pretty thankless task and makes an absolute stellar job of it. He doesn't try to impersonate Hartnell wisely, but instead simply plays his own interpretation of the first Doctor. Not only is he excellent, but he also more than holds his own up against bona fide Doctor legends like Patrick Troughton and Jon Pertwee, and succeeds in blowing the established 5th Doctor, Peter Davison, well and truly off the screen. He makes an entirely credible incarnation of the Doctor in his own right, and part of me wishes he could have got his own series. Indeed, the fact that he is only in this 1 story is the only reason he is not much higher in this list. 10. David Tennant. The Fang Earls and New Who Ski Brigade will be beside themselves at their God coming so low, but yeah, Tennant's Doctor is as schizophrenic as the quality of his era in my view. Tennant alternates between being bland, decent, wildly eye-rollingly over the top, decent, annoying as all fuckery and occasionally decent. Likewise his era blasts between the utterly retarded Series 2 and the actually really rather good Series 3, with Series 4 kind of a bit of both, bouncing off the walls between good stuff like Silence in the Library, Midnight and the Fun Sontaran Romp, and some of the worst television ever broadcast such as Partners in Crime. Fires of Pompeii and the Execrable Journey's End, at the time the worst Doctor Who story. To be fair, these days it is easy to cherry-pick the good ones from this era and ignore the shit, which does at least indicate there is good stuff here, which is more than you can say for Capaldi's run so far. 9. Matt Smith. The 11th Doctor is even more of a stumper than Tennant, because in his first season he's the best new series Doctor by several million light years, with the best TARDIS crew of the new series, and yet by his third he's as punchably irritating as Tennant at his absolute worst, and the overall quality of his era seems to slide ever downwards along with his performance, beginning with Series 5, the best season of New Who, and ending with Series 7. One of the absolute worst of all time. If he'd left after Series 5 or even 6, he'd probably be a lot higher on this list. 8. Christopher Eccleston. The short-lived 9th Doctor is still my favorite new series Doctor, not least because he fucked off before he could be ruined, and I'm not sure even the mighty Eccles cake could have done anything to rescue the sheer shiteness of Series 2. Granted, it would probably have been a teeny-weeny bit less shit just by the sheer weight of the actor's presence and natural gravitas, but on the other hand it might have done a Series 7 and torpedoed his run like that Crapulafest did poor old Smithies. Still, even with just one season, temperamental old Chris gave a barnstorming performance as a very different and yet wholly convincing Doctor, and the guy put everything he had into it. The Empty Child remains the best new series story and one of the few in my all-time classic list. 7. Jon Pertwee. The third Doctor comes in at number 7, surprisingly bottom of the list for the classic Doctors, which is odd as until recently that position was held by the 5th Doctor. Don't get me wrong, Pert fans, I think Pertwee is a great Doctor, but I do have a slight problem with some of his era. Season 7 is fantastic and it's a crying shame this more adult and gritty style didn't carry on longer, because it was fucking awesome and because the dumbed down Barry Letts cartoon comic book style is often a bit insipid and a lot of the time, particularly in seasons 8 and 9, has dated pretty horribly, way more than 99.9% of the 60s era. That is not to say there is not still some stuff to love in that period, such as the best and most underrated 70s Daleks story, Day of the Daleks, The Three Doctors, Carnival of Monsters and The Time Warrior, but in some ways it almost reminds me of the Tennant era in that you have to cherry-pick the great from the often truly awful. Hello the Mutants, hello the Time Monster, hello Claws of Axos, etc. 6. Peter Davison. The 5th Doctor streams into 6th place, not because I particularly rate him, but just because I recently realized there's actually more stories of his I like than there is Jon's. Which was a bit of a surprise really. Not that I dislike Davison, although he can be a bit bland at times and I'm not thrilled by many of his companions, particularly Tegan and Adric. But his era, while not my favorite by any stretch of the imagination, still has plenty of real gems such as Black Orchid, Earthshock, Snake Dance, the Black Guardian Trilogy, The 5 Doctors, The Awakening and more. I'm growing fonder of it as I get older, which should just make you all go. 5. Colin Baker. Yes folks, Big Colin makes it into 5th place. Despite a far too short tenure, just 2 seasons, and I'm not overly fond of the second one, I do love Colin's Doctor. He's camp, he's theatrical, he's rude, he's massively watchable and hugely hilarious. I love his relationship with Perry and his first season remains one of the most underrated and overall best seasons of the show ever. He's the best audio Doctor on Big Finish too. And while I try not to let that kind of thing affect rankings such as these, as I think the actual television run of a Doctor far more important than such spin-off ephemera, his enthusiasm and passion for the role and the series, coupled with a lack of appreciation not so much for him these days but certainly for his underrated era, makes him an underdog I love to root for. He got bad scripts, the YouTube comment illiterate continue to insist. Well, those bad scripts piss all over the great majority of stories the new Who doctors have been given for the last 12 years, so stick that in your cakehole and shut your fucking faces, cunts. 4. Pascal's Trick Troughton. The mighty Trout is in a bit of a pickle, given the missing status of so much of his era's stories, and yet there are very few fans of any denomination who don't unconditionally love the Pat. Of course, much of this is down to the performance of the man himself, who is utterly brilliant in the role and never seems to phone it in even when he's in a right pile of shit. Hello the Dominators. The Trout was always ready and willing to pick up where he left off too. Of course, coming back to the series on no less than 3 occasions after his departure. For the 10th anniversary special with the Pert, the 20th anniversary special with Devoe, and then for season 22 with Colin for no reason other than JNT thought it a good idea. Which it was. Of course, much of what does remain of his era is brilliant too, particularly the War Games, the Invasion, and the recently returned masterpiece The Web of Fear, which turned out to be every bit as wonderful as I'd always dreamed and hoped it would be. And many of those individual scraps of missing stories such as Evil, Faceless Ones, Snowmen and Wheels seem to promise such wonderful things too. 3. Sylvester McCoy. Between Sylvester and Colin it's difficult to see who's most underrated these days. Both suffer from the fandom ignorati still persisting in the belief that they suffered from poor writing, before turning around and praising gobshite like The Magician's Apprentice. Newsflash folks, someone dared me to watch Series 9, I lasted 20 minutes of the first episode before turning it off and watching Elementary instead. What complete and utter awfully written and acted pissflakes. But I digress. Sylv was the Doctor Who's run I saw on telly at the time as a kid, and while season 24 seems largely loathed, I still quite like it to be honest, especially Dragonfire, and seasons 25 and 26 are 2 of the greatest seasons of all time. Oh, if only the current show was even half as good, then we'd have something, eh folks? His partnership with the glorious Sophie Aldred as Ace is one of the greatest in the entire series, and stories like Remembrance, Ghostlight, Fenric and Survival stand as some of the best of all time and make one positively weep at the speed-written, self-indulgent, plotless assholery masquerading as Doctor Who stories these days. My Doctor. To William Hartnell. The first Doctor is my second favorite Doctor of all time. The great William Hartnell remains woefully underappreciated by fandom to this day, usually loitering at the bottom of favorite Doctor fan polls with poor old Colin. I myself was guilty of this crime once upon a time, as a kid, not being overly fond of him or his era, which, in the days where I OCD-like watched the series in order, regarding the Hartnell era as the fag end of the show you had to get through in order to reach the good stuff. To say my opinion has done an almost complete 180 turn is not inaccurate. The beginning of my turnaround on this Doctor and era was with the DVDs, really. Although I'd liked a couple of stories like The Chase and The Time Meddler, it was the DVDs with clear picture and perfect, non-hissy sound, that really started to turn me around, even on stories like The Web Planet, which I, like most of fandom, had hated as a kid but which I'm rather fond of now. The other factor that changed the era in my estimation was, after years of random viewing, watching it in order on DVD in the late 2000s. I absolutely fell in love with it on this particular marathon, and this opinion is now set in stone. I love the first Doctor. Season 2 is one of my absolute favorites, as is the team with Barbara, Bardashian and gorgeous little Vicky. I love the magic of his era, the atmosphere, the feeling that genuinely anything could happen, the mysteriousness and the real feeling of being lost in time and space and exploring the complete unknown, a feeling the series never quite recaptured again after this point and is completely missing with the new Who Know-All Doctor. I fucking love Hartnell. 1. Tom Baker. It's a cliché, especially for classic fans, but as is often actually the case, clichés become clichés because they're true. Tom Baker is my favorite Doctor, the greatest Doctor there ever was and ever will be. No one will top his stint, No one will top his performance, and no one, particularly in light of current standards, will ever top the sheer quality of his era. Tom and Lala's Romana 2 are my fave TARDIS team, but Tom and Leela and Tom and Mary are also much loved by me. Season 14 is one of the greatest seasons ever, and the Williams era my overall favorite. I hope you enjoyed this video, and feel free to list your favorites below.